And I remember thinking, well, that's kind of silly. Why are they, why is this Jewish Bible calling this the exile? Okay, well, I don't know, it's maybe a year or two later, when I noticed something about this, and the only thing you need to do to see this, analogy is realize that Abraham is married, just as Abraham is married to Sarah, so likewise Adonai, our God, the Holy One, is married to Israel, or the children of Israel, right? So you just need to see that analogy. Abraham is married to Sarah, right? And just like Adonai is married to Israel. So here's what you need to do. If in this story of Genesis 12, 10 through 20, if you replace Abraham with Adonai, and if you replace Sarah with Israel, okay, if you do that, you just make that simple substitution, that analogy, you're going to see that this story right here is actually a prophecy of future events, okay? So, let's look at it from that point of view. A famine in Canaan caused Abraham to descend with Sarai into Egypt, right? Remember that? Remember, it was a famine. He got to the land of Canaan. There was a famine, so they had to go to Egypt. Well, the same thing happened in Genesis 42, verse 5. Whoa, let's go back. What happened here? Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. The same thing happened in Genesis 42, 5. It was a famine in Canaan that led Jacob to send his sons to Egypt, which ultimately caused the entire family to descend to Egypt. Okay? So now that, in and of itself, alone is, it's a connection. It may or may not mean anything on its own, okay? The fact that when Abraham got to the land, there was a famine and he had to go to Egypt. And the same thing, there was a famine that caused Jacob's entire family to have to go to Egypt. Okay, good connection, but is it that significant? Well, let's keep comparing what happens with Abraham. So Abraham went to Egypt to sojourn there, it says. If you go in Genesis 12, it says that he sojourned there. Well, in the book of Genesis, it also says that the children of Israel sojourned in Egypt. Okay? Okay, so that's two connections, and again, it's kind of like, okay, well, maybe that's significant, maybe it's not significant. All right, let me move over here because the sun is getting to me. The famine in Genesis 12 and Genesis 42 were both characterized as being severe famines, okay? It wasn't just, a little bit of famine. They were both categorized as being severe. Okay, so you see what's kind of happening right now. We're starting to see all of these analogies between these two stories. So let's find out, where it's going to take us. All right? Before arriving in Egypt, Abraham convinced Sarah to change her identity, right? Now remember, Sarah was married to Abraham. So before they get there, Abraham says to Sarah, tell them you're my sister, right? So when they get there, the Egyptians, they don't know that Sarah is Abraham's bride, right? They don't know that Sarah is Abraham's bride. So likewise, in the story of the Exodus, the Egyptians did not know that the children of Israel were married to him. Okay, they didn't have that. When they got all the children of Israel down there, they weren't like, oh, this is the children of Israel. They are the bride of Adonai. They didn't know. Okay, they didn't know. Just like the Egyptians didn't know that Sarah was Abraham's bride. Now, just as Sarah tried to take Sarah for his own possession. Now, why did Pharaoh take Sarah? What was the reason? She was beautiful, right? And what was he going to do with her? He's going to right. She was going to just become part of his harem, right? She was just going to be one of his probably many wives, right? He was going to make her a concubine. He was going to marry her. She would have just been another one of his wives, okay? She would have basically been a concubine to him. Well, Pharaoh tried to take Sarah for his own possession by forcing her to marry him. Eventually, it was a Pharaoh who took the children of Israel as his own possession. Okay? You see that? So you see all these analogies here. So in other words, as we read the story of Abraham and his his descent into Egypt, what I'm getting at here is that we're actually seeing a picture of history being played out, where the children of Israel one day will walk through the exact same steps that Abraham walked through, because the scriptures are prophetic, okay? So let's look at another one. Now this is the one that got me to thinking back in like 2001, 2002 or whatever. This connection right here is what kind of blew it open for me. The Holy One sent plagues on Pharaoh and his household because of Sarah. You remember that? Remember when Sarah was in Abraham's house, and it says that Adonai plagued Sarah. It says that Adonai plagued Pharaoh and his household. And as a result of Adonai plaguing Pharaoh and their household, Sarah was able to leave, okay? Well, in the Exodus account, how did Adonai get Pharaoh to let go of the children of Israel? He sent plagues, right? He sent plagues, the exact same thing. The Holy One used plagues against Pharaoh and the land of Egypt because he possessed, through slavery, the people of Israel. Excuse me, and in both cases, the result was the release of the bride. And here's another one. When Abraham left Egypt, he left with much of Egypt's wealth. Did he not? Remember when he left, it says that that Pharaoh gave Abraham all sorts of men servants, maid servants, camels, sheep, all sorts of stuff for Sarah's sake, right? Well, remember when the children of Israel, when they left with much of the wealth of Egypt that they had taken from the Egyptians. Okay, so it's the same thing. So in other words, yes.
Not taken, freely given.
Freely given, yes. They were freely given. This is true. But as you can see here, everything that happened with Abraham happened with the children of Israel. So the real essence of this story, can someone please give me a glass of water? Got something on the throat. Abraham's descent into Egypt is actually a prophecy of the events that would later happen to the nation of Israel. Okay? Thank you. All right. How many of you guys see that? That makes sense? Okay? So we're just watching Abraham's life. And again, this is one of those things where the Jewish sages, they said that the lives of the patriarchs are prophetic pictures of the nation of Israel. Now, here's one way to look at it. Well, I don't want to look at that way. What I want to do is this. I want to go right to Jacob's life. So what we're about to do is we're about to look at Jacob's life. And as we watch Jacob's life, we're going to see this prophetic story play out again, okay? Where just as with Abraham, as we watched Abraham's life and as we made certain connections, we can see that everything that happened with Abraham happened to the children of Israel. Right now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at Jacob's life and we're going to see the same thing play out. So let me ask you a question. Is there anyone here who could see how in Jacob's life, where was there a picture of exile? Exile meaning having to leave the land and go somewhere else. Can anyone tell me what story in Jacob's life can be seen as exile? Yes?
The situation with Esau.
Perfect. The situation with Esau. Esau wanted to kill Jacob, right? And so Jacob left and went to Padan Aram, right? Now, that was Jacob's exile, okay? And I say exile. It wasn't like he was exiled because of a famine or something like that. But what happened is he had to leave his ancestral plot of land and go somewhere else and live somewhere else, right? Okay, so that is his exile. Now, you reread about this in Genesis 29, 1 through 21. So there's certain things that happen in Genesis 29, 1 through 21. Number one was his arrival in Padan Aram, okay? So he got there, remember he got to Uncle Laban's, and he fell in love with Rachel. And initially, everything was going well, okay? Initially, everything was going well. Well, this is parallel with the exile of the children of Israel in Genesis 47, 11 through 12. Now, what we're going to do is I want you to notice, hey, get back. I want you to notice in Genesis 29, 1 through 11. On this side here, we're going to chronologically go through events that happened in Jacob's life. On this side, where it says Genesis 47, 11 through 12, we're going to chronologically go through events that occurred in the children of Israel's lives, okay? Thank you. So, all right. So Jacob, he initially arrives in Padan Aram. Everything's fine, okay? He falls in love with Rachel. Everything's going fine. Well, the same thing kind of happened with the children of Israel, where children of Israel, they have to leave Canaan. They go to Egypt. Jacob went to Padan Aram, but the children of Israel went to Egypt. In both cases, the point is that they had to leave Canaan and go somewhere else. It wasn't the same place, but they were exiled away. They received the land of Goshen, which was the best land. And initially, everything, at the end of Genesis chapter 50, everything's going great with the children of Israel, right? Okay? So let's see what happens next. Enslavement. So how do we see enslavement in Jacob's life? Well, in Genesis 29, 22 to 30, Jacob was deceived into working longer for Rachel, okay? Now, when you work for someone, well, he was deceived into working longer for her when he should not have had to do that. So he was deceived, and he was deceived into working for her. That right there is connected to Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 14, where the children of Israel were deceived into working for the Egyptians as slaves, okay? Into working for the Egyptians as slaves, all right? So that's the parallel that we're making there. Let's keep going on. What's the story in Jacob's life that talks about a proliferation or reproduction? Anybody remember?
To his wives and all his kids, and at the same time he's got all the sheep.
Right. So what happened is, if we look in Genesis 29, 31 through Genesis 30, verse 25, what we're going to see is that it was just Jacob and Rachel and Leah, right? And within like one chapter, there's like 11 boys and a girl. I think it was 11 boys and a girl, right? I mean, it was, and Leah conceived, and Leah conceived, and Leah conceived, right? And Rachel couldn't conceive. And then it was, and Bilhah conceived, and Bilhah, and then Zilpah, and then Leah, and Leah. And then finally in Rachel. So in a little less than one chapter, what happened is Jacob proliferated abundantly. Well, that is thematically connected to what happened in Egypt. Because after the children of Israel got there, everything was not good. Everything was working out well for them at first. But then you have the children of Israel's proliferation, where they grew abundantly. And that's what got them in trouble. So just like with Jacob, how Jacob's family grew very, very quickly, so likewise with the children of Israel, when they went into Egypt, they grew very, very quickly, and they became so numerous, okay? So again, if you notice what we're doing, all we're doing here is just comparing these two stories. As we go chronologically through these two stories, we're comparing them, and what we're going to see is that there are all of these coincidences that everything that happened to Jacob is happening to the children of Israel. Okay? Let's look at another one. Bondage. In Genesis 31, verse 7, and verses 38 through 42, we read about how Jacob served Laban for 20 years. He bore all the business losses, how heat consumed him by day. He didn't sleep at night, and apart from Adonai's intervention, he would have had nothing. So what's going on here? You remember when Jacob decided he was going to leave, and remember he left stealthily. He didn't let Laban know. So Laban found out, okay, Jacob left, he took my daughters. Laban was upset. So Laban tracks after him, finds him, catches up with him, and says, what is this that you're going to leave and take all of my children and everything? And so he confronts Jacob. Now you guys remember, up until this point, Jacob is always running from trouble, right? Okay? Up until this point, Jacob is just running from trouble. He ran from Esau, now he's running from Laban. But at this point, when Laban confronted him for the first time, Jacob stood up on his own 2 feet, and he said, look, let me tell you what life was with you. He says, look, I served you for 20 years. He said, I bore all the business losses with your sheep. He said, heat consumed me by day. I didn't sleep at night. And he says, apart from Adonai's intervention, I would have had nothing. The reason why I said that is because remember, Laban was playing tricks with the sheep. Number one, he was changing his wages, right? Number one, he was changing his wages. And then number two, he tried to trick. You remember he told Jacob that Jacob could take all the spotted, all of the spotted, ringed, and ringed, the flock that had all the wild colors and everything. Well, this is what happened. The deception was this. Laban allowed Jacob to take these spotted and ringed sheep and everything. But what Laban did was Laban still had Jacob taking care of Laban's sheep. Okay? Jacob wasn't taking care of his own sheep. Laban allowed Jacob to take those sheep as his own, but Laban wanted Jacob to take it because Laban saw that Jacob was blessed. And so what we see that happen, though, is that instead of Laban's sheep proliferating, Jacob's did. But here's the point. The point is that Jacob said, apart from Adonai's intervention, I wouldn't have anything, because Adonai turned the table on Laban. So what I'm saying to you is this. I have a question for you. If you work for someone for 20 years, and heat consumes you by day, you lose sleep, you hardly get any sleep, and you work, and if you didn't have a profit at all, what would you call that? You call it slavery. When you work for someone else and you get nothing, and you do it year after year after year after year, that's called slavery. Now, the only reason why Jacob wound up having anything is because Adonai was watching out for him. If Adonai had not watched out for him, Jacob, after 20 years, he would have had nothing. He would have just worked basically for free. Well, that's thematically connected to the children of Israel. Egypt oppressed and enslaved Israel. Heat consumed them by day, and they became slaves, and they had nothing. Okay? So everything that's happening to Jacob is happening to the children of Israel. All right? Now let's see what's going on next. All right. So the next major event is Genesis 31. And again, we're still just going chronologically through the story. And it talks about how Jacob fled with his children and his belongings. Okay? So Jacob fled. He left. And he didn't tell Laban. All right? And what we're going to see is that the children of Israel, they left. They fled Egypt, right? After the plagues and everything, they were able to leave Egypt also with their belongings. So now we see Jacob leaves, the children of Israel leave. And then what happens? When Jacob left, in Genesis 31, 22 through 24, what happened? Laban pursued him and caught up with him and confronted him, right? Well, the same thing is going to happen with the children of Israel. They left Egypt with all their belongings, and then when Pharaoh found out, Pharaoh's like, hey, we're going to go pursue these guys, and we're going to go and catch them and kill them. And that's what they tried to do. Egypt pursued Israel. Okay? Egypt pursued Israel. So just like Laban pursued Jacob, Egypt pursued the children of Israel. All right, and so that brings us to, where is that Bible? Thank you. Right in front of my face. We're going to read Genesis 33. All right. So, let's recap. Jacob fled, children of Israel fled. Laban pursued, Egyptians pursued. So that's the point where we are. So we are now in, let's turn to Exodus chapter, Genesis 33:17. Right. So to catch you up in the story of Jacob, Jacob fled. Laban, they had a little confrontation. They set a covenant between them. The next thing that happened is Jacob had to face Esau. Genesis 33. Once he faced Esau, he was on his way to the land. This was his first stop in the land. So let's look and let's start reading in verse 15. Genesis 33:15. And Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of the people who are with me." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. And Jacob, now notice what it says here. It says, and Jacob journeyed to where? Sukkot. And it says, he built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the name of the place is called Sukkot. Okay? Now, notice what happened here. After, this is after they've arrived in the land, the very, very first place that they get to after they come back from exile. Now remember, this story of Jacob is the story of his exile. So Jacob, he goes into exile in Padan Aram, and now he's coming back. And the first place that he gets to, over in the land, they're saying, well, let's read it again. It says, and Jacob journeyed to Sukkot. Now, that place probably wasn't named that at first, but it was after they went there, because it says that they built Sukkot, or booths, for their animals, okay? Now, here again is the prophetic nature. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn to Exodus chapter 13. So let's turn over to Exodus chapter 13, and we're going to read starting verse 17. All right. So now the children of Israel, they've been confronted with Pharaoh. They're being confronted. Let's see here. All right. Well, Pharaoh hasn't confronted them yet. All right. So beginning in verse 17. Then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go. So the people have left, just like Jacob had left Padan Aram. The children of Israel had left Egypt. That God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near, for God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. Now listen to what it says. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children under a solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. Now notice what it says here. So they took their journey from, you know what? I don't want to, that's not what I want. That's the verse that I was, all right, hold on, sorry about that. That is the wrong reference there. Excuse me. Okay. That is the wrong reference. Go to Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12. Starting in verse 33. And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste. For they said, we shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. All right, now, so here's the important part. They're leaving Egypt, right? They've done their exile, and now they're leaving. And let's look at the first place that they go to. It says, then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot. Okay? So just like Jacob, when Jacob left, Jacob left Padan Aram, and the first place that he gets to over in the land of Israel, when he gets there, right after meeting Esau, is Sukkot. And the same thing here. The children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, in flocks and herds, and a great deal of livestock. Okay? So, what's going on here is the Torah is just painting this picture for us of how Jacob's life is a prophetic picture of what's going to happen with the children of Israel. Everything that happened to Jacob, the fact that Jacob had to leave the land of Israel, and the fact that he had to go into exile away from the land, and then how he would suffer, and then he would return, and the first thing that he did when he got back to the land was he built booths, or Sukkot. And the same thing is played out here when the children of Israel, when they leave Egypt. They left Ramesses, and the very first place they go to is a place called Sukkot. And probably what happened there, think about this, the children of Israel, they had been in Egypt all these years. They leave Egypt, and where are they going to go? Right? What are they going to do? So, right, they leave and they start going. I mean, it's not like they can all buy a train ticket and head over somewhere. They're just out there. They're out there with the Lord. And so what do? They obviously built booths, okay? And so what's going to happen, this is the reason why we know that when Yeshua returns, one of the first things that's going to happen is going to be the celebration of Sukkot. Because he's going to return in the fall. And remember, we already talked about, earlier this month at Beit Israel, we already talked about the trumpet, the Feast of Trumpets, how there's a resurrection associated with that. We also talked about Yom Kippur, how there's a resurrection associated with that, where Adonai is going to gather all the dead who have died in Messiah, right, and take people to the land. And what's going to happen? When you get to the land, then it's going to be a celebration of Sukkot. Just like Jacob, when Jacob had his exile, and when he made it back to the land, the first thing he did was he built booths. Just like the children of Israel, when they left Egypt, and that's the key. Jacob was in exile, and then when he came back from exile, he built booths. The same thing happened with the children of Israel. We just saw in Exodus chapter 12. They were in exile. They left exile, and the first thing that they did was they went to a place called Sukkot, because Adonai is teaching us through these stories that that's what's going to happen at the end of days, that ultimate return to the land. Okay, we have to always remember that. The greatest event that the Old Testament is looking forward to is when Adonai returns and he gathers the exiles from all the nations. Okay, we remember that, right? Because we know that the children of Israel are going to be scattered in all the nations. Here is the fun part and the secret part. The fun part of that and the secret part of that is that although the Old Testament only talks about the physical exile of Israel away from the land of Israel, and that one day God would come and bring them back, we now know that that return of Israel is at the same time that Messiah returns, and it's the resurrection where all Israelites from all ages, they're going to be resurrected, caught up in the air, and then literally brought back to the land of Israel. Okay, so it's a combination of the literal physical return of Israel of the Israelites to Israel. It is combined with the resurrection. And so the first thing that's going to happen after that is Sukkot. So that's why Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, they have to do with that resurrection. They have to do with gathering the people, Anani's people from the nations. And then what's left after Yom Kippur? Sukkot. Okay? So this is part of why we're here, why we're celebrating. Okay? And so remember, these are the holy days. These are God's appointed times, His fixed times, His meeting times. That's why we're here this week. We're just practicing. Because one day there's going to be a Sukkot when Yeshua is going to return to the earth. He's going to return to the earth, and I have no idea how this is going to work out, about who's going over to the land, okay. I guess I'm supposed to stop now. Time's up. That was it. Yes. Right, that's what the church calls the rapture. Yep. All right. So, I was at the end anyway, so it just helped me end it. It just helped me end faster. All right. So we need to build our sukkah. All right.